Hey, John here, John's Sword Discovery. Got a fun one for you today. Dun 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 dun. Something neat like that. The double-bladed axe. Classic, maybe ubiquitous. Certainly fantastical. At least most would say so. The double-bladed axe, a favorite in modern fantasy, some science fiction, literature, novels, the list goes on. Favorite movies and TV shows. Certainly an iconic image in dreams of warriors and barbarians in distant worlds and distant times. Generally considered not so much of an historic item, though that's debatable in a longer, more developed conversation we might have in a future video. But for the most part, something very similar to this is mostly thought of as a fantasy weapon, and understandably so. But just the same, the design from its aesthetic point of view, from its look, from the images and the sort of the aura, things that it sort of brings the evocative notion of fantasy and adventure. Certainly anything from things like Conan the Barbarian to dwarven axes and various things from Dungeons and Dragons, all that fun good stuff, or modern classics like the various works of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. Double-bladed axes have found their way into this niche and have long been a part of modern lore when it comes to arms and armor and weapons. They come in a variety of different forms and shapes, like so many things often limited to the imagination, but also to practical, functional aspects, if it's going to be functional. If it's not, then it can still be an interesting, unique piece just from a visual sort, whether it's illustrated or drawn or, put in some form of artwork, or if it's actually physically brought to life as a prop or an actual real weapon, to be used, as a collector or some form of LARPing or actual experimental martial arts or in film. But this one particularly in case, is a design in its specific form that is actually very practical and well thought out for trying to convert what can often be very interesting but not so realistic forms as far as whether or not they're going to actually work, or they could work when actually used in a real world context to fight and battle or use in a combative situation. That's not always seen in a great variety, or probably should say the majority of designs that you see out there. This one, however, is not so much like those. This, in quite contrast, is a very well thought out functional piece, both in its overall form, its shape, but in particularly in its proportions and size and head to haft ratio. This was designed and made by Museum Replicas Limited, Windlass, and in this case they actually really, I think, hit the mark in finding something that could conceivably be used, and if one wanted to, certainly would be a usable and practical piece that would function smoothly, handle well. The weight is very good. The overall balance for an axe of this type is very acceptable and would actually work in a real world scenario. So this example with these piercings, more decorative, but certainly lighten a little bit, two basically congruent or equal shape and size and proportion blades on a nice metal enclosed socket with that nice sort of multifaceted top section, and a nice butt section of very similar form and shape used to make a butt cap with, as we can see right here. So in addition, the haft is wrapped at least part way with some slim but still well done, I think, leather bindings with some studs that actually, of course, help in their main function for gripping and to keep the hand from slipping when and where you don't want it to. Of course, with the right technique, axes often are slipped with certain strikes and techniques, and we can cover that in future videos. We certainly will. But for grip retention, they do their job, and they're done in a manner that I think is still fairly pleasing to look at. So When you look at the piece overall, this is a good example of how what is essentially a fantasy piece can be brought to life in a realistic way that could be used if one wanted to, and certainly shows that it could have been used not only in a sort of fantasy or alternative history setting, which are fun and interesting to talk about and debate and recreate in certain ways anyway, but could have worked in a real world, real history setting too, if they existed. Now, there are a few rare examples that I have seen. The provenance being debated a little bit of a double-bladed axe, a little bit larger but similar, but not exactly the same head shape as this, attributed to the early 16th century, and that's mounted on a pole that's more or less, I think, about 5 feet tall, so less than a halberd, but more like a late medieval pole axe. But as far as I can tell, I didn't mean to do more research. It is an authentic piece. Details its provenance and how it's classified and other factors are still sort of open to debate, but there are rare examples throughout history where you can see things like this, not like this per se, but in the double-bladed axe category, normally easily or frequently dismissed by most historians and armed collectors as pure fantasy. They do in fact creep up here or there, and you can find examples that are worthy of further study and further investigation into the timeline and context they fit into on the historical side of things in Arms and Armor. There are some very good period artworks from the classical Greek era depicting Amazons, probably Scythian or Scythian-related tribes with very small versions, probably made out of iron or bronze, that likely reflected real-world examples, as well as in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. In that general range, there are some surviving examples from the Eastern world, the Ottoman Turks, and I believe also some of the possibly the Marathas in the Indian subcontinent did in fact have several variations of shorter, mostly what we consider cavalry axes. Some of them did have double-bladed cutting blades of congruent form that would fall into that broad classification of what we consider the double-bladed axe. So there are some analogs from real historical context. They're not entirely fictitious, but they're not common on the broad side of things. In general, they're quite rare and in very particular forms, not so much the two-handed or hand-and-a-half version we see. There's relatively little corresponding versions, except at least for that one I mentioned earlier, which, though interesting, is still up for further research and debate as to its origins, at least that I've yet to uncover. But definitely a fun, ongoing topic, whether it's from the historical side of thing or designing, making, and using alternative culture weapons, which I've also spent many years doing, that can be very functional and usable in their own way while still having their own interesting and evocative design forms and possible, histories to be associated with them, alternative histories, say that, in fantasy recreative settings, which are an interesting and enjoyable thing in their own right, so long as we keep them in their own nice category and historical items and real world histories in their own nice category. But again, fun and cool. This actually balances quite well, and even some historical techniques from HEMA can be translated and adapted into a weapon of this size, form, proportion, and can actually be used in a manner that is practical, makes sense, and can be demonstratively effective. See, even the top can be used to trap and bind and twist, and hooking maneuvers can be used with the bottom and the open section here, perhaps on the rim of the shield, and extending cutting edge can work wonders for slicing and chopping using various kind of cutting and slashing techniques, and a nice butt for striking, and a nice haft for leverage and blocks and checks. But that's all for now. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like and subscribe button below. Stay tuned for more interesting Arms and Armor investigations and videos in the future, including some interesting off the beaten path fantasy pieces like this, as well, of course, many historically inspired pieces as well. That's all for now. See you soon. Thanks, y'all. Bye bye.